Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Fidel Shaw, and I will be serving as your MC for today's event, looking upstream at problems and opportunities on the exotic Colorado River as the Dean's Brand Ambassador, UCR School of Public Policy. The seminar is part of the Water Economics and Policy Outreach activities of the UCR School of Public Policy, called Water Dialogue, Getting to Know Your Water Agencies and Policymakers, which is led by Dr. Mead. Water policy design and implementation is a process that involves the policymakers, the agencies that apply the policy, and the public that is subject to the policy. California has long been subject to many water policy interventions. Opening a dialogue among the public, the water agencies, the policymakers would enhance the implementation of better and more effective water policies. You can learn more about the water dialogue at waterdialogue.ucr.edu. Before moving on to the presentation, I just want to cover a few notes on the format of this event. We will have our two guest speakers present for about 30 to 45 minutes. Afterwards, we will open up to the audience for a Q&A of about 15 minutes. If you're part of the Zoom audience, please enter your questions via the Zoom webinar Q&A feature. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for today's event. Mr. Zach Frankel received his BS in biology at the University of Utah and is the executive director of the Utah Rivers Council, which was founded in 1994. He completed additional coursework at the University of Washington in river ecology and water law before working for both Idaho Rivers United and the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. He has led many exciting campaigns to protect Utah's rivers and is an expert on Utah water policy. He lives with his family and their horses in the Salt Lake Valley and enjoys writing, whitewater canoeing, and all manners of outdoor sports. Mr. Nick Halberg received an honors PS in economics with an emphasis in statistical analysis and a PS in philosophy of science from the University of Utah. He is a research and policy analyst at the Utah Rivers Council, where he works on issues in the Colorado River Basin and Great Basin. His focus is on researching various scientific topics associated with water policy, from hydrology to climate science to economics, and translating those findings into understandable and implementable policy actions. During non-work hours, Nick can be found kayaking, climbing, and exploring new and wild places throughout the American West. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Frankel and Mr. Halberg.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. Thank you for your interest in water and the Colorado River, and thank you for hosting us. Thank you to the University of California at Riverside School of Public Policy. We are honored to be here and really excited to talk with you about some of the challenges upstream here on the Colorado River Basin. And we also want to thank our wonderful and very kind hosts here, aridification, Mead, and Daniel Crespo. Thank you for your kindness in hosting us and inviting us down to speak and working with us as colleagues. We are really looking forward to the next few years with you guys on the Colorado River. So as we talk about the Colorado River, one of the things that fails to sometimes get through is the fact that it's an exotic river. That the Colorado River is in some ways similar to the Nile, because the headwaters of the Colorado River, where the water is coming from, is so far away from those of us that live down here at near its terminus in the river. And so it's considered an actual exotic river. One of the things we learned from Ariel, as a wonderful water scholar, is that the Colorado River is an exotic river. And to understand that, we're going to take a little tour of the Colorado River Basin. We're going to look upstream. So I apologize, I'm a pacer, so I might be walking around. I hope that doesn't mess with the online presentation. I have a problem sitting still. So of course, here's the Colorado River flowing across 7 states in the American West and Mexico. And what's interesting about the Colorado River is that it has an arbitrary definition into 2 geographies of upper and lower basin. That arbitrary definition really serves no functional purpose, and in fact is an impediment to collaboration, policy making, and working together to adapt to our shared climate change future. We'll get into that in a moment. As I mentioned, here's the upper and lower basin, and we are in a watershed of 40 million people. You know, down here in the Los Angeles basin, it's hard to even talk about the fact that we're in a watershed. Now, technically, we're outside of the watershed basin. We're outside the physical geography of the Colorado River. But like many communities in cities across these 7 states, we are using Colorado River here in the Los Angeles basin and in other basins outside of the watershed of the Colorado River. Many of the cities of the American Southwest are using Colorado River water, even though they are outside the basin of the Colorado. And as I mentioned, it's exotic, meaning the water is very far away where it originates. 85% of the water in the Colorado River is coming from the snow melt that is far upstream in the mountains of Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. Specifically, of course, the Colorado Rockies we hear a lot about, but the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming, the Uinta Mountains in Utah, and the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado and a little bit of Utah. So this is where the water of the Colorado River is coming from. So it also is home, the basin is also home to America's 2 largest reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, respectively. So this is an iconic watershed in the United States. Now, if we take a look at the policy architecture of the Colorado River, which is necessary for understanding the scope of challenges we must overcome, there's essentially 3 policies. Now, you'll hear this term in Colorado River policy a lot, the law of the river, which is one of these wonderfully nebulous terms that doesn't sound like it really means anything. The law of the river is code for all of the decisions that have been made about the Colorado River. So for example, Supreme Court decisions in the judicial branch of government, legislation that has been passed by Congress, and agreements that have been ratified by Congress, but chiefly negotiated by the 7 states together with Mexico. So that collective compendium, if you will, of all of this together is called the law of the river. And it's 101 years old right now, because it all began really in 1922 with the compact. One can argue the treaty negotiations, the treaty obligations that we as a country in the United States have with the sovereign nations, the 30-some tribes of the basin, are also part of the river, the law of the river, and they predate even what is commonly described as the problem in the Colorado River, which is the 1922 compact. But if I just try and build some of the basic architecture of the law of the river so that you guys can know enough to be dangerous, that's the first one, the 1922 compact, which said that the upper basin and the lower basin each get 7.5 million acre-feet of water. But it's been stacked to clearly indicate that the lower basin gets its 7.5 million acre-feet of water first. I'm sorry if I'm moving around too much.
Don't worry.
I'm like my children, I can't sit still. So the lower basin gets its water first. The reason for that is because the population of the lower basin was more established at the time of the 22 compact. Much of Nevada and Utah at that time and Wyoming were especially sparsely populated. So they didn't just anticipate there would be millions and millions of people in it. So the second piece of the pillar of the architecture is the 44 treaty with Mexico. The United States must deliver 1.5 million acre-feet of water to Mexico. Okay, so right now, if we add these together, right, we're at 9 million acre-feet, with just focusing on the lower basin states and Mexico together. That's the upper basin not having a drop of water. So try to remember that number, 9 million. And of course, the third piece is the supplemental compact, the 1948 Upper Basin Compact, which addressed a little bit of this architecture and said, like I said, the upper basin gets the leftovers. After those deliveries are made, the upper basin states get their water, and they get their water, these 4 states get their water in the delivery of these percentages of the leftovers. So if there's 15 million acre feet of water in the system, then after you subtract this 9 million, and the math, how you interpret the Treaty with Mexico obligation, and who delivers that water, then the states, the upper basin states, get the leftovers. Utah gets 23% of the leftovers, Wyoming gets 14%, Colorado gets about 52%, and New Mexico gets about 11%. Okay, so if there's 15 or 16 million acre feet of water in the system, no problem. But once the water volumes start declining, major problems. And that's what we've observed in climate change. That's what the chorus of climate change science indicates quite clearly. And so one of the conventions used to see the effects of climate change is shown here, of taking the water flow records from this 21st century, from year 2000 onward, to segment that from the rest of the historic record of the 20th century. And it's a simple approximation that a lot of climate scientists have utilized in the Colorado River to sort of see the effects of climate change. And just so we're on the same page, you might ask yourself, what is climate change doing exactly to the Colorado River? Well, of course, we already discussed most of the water is coming from that snowpack, that snow melt in the headwaters from our spring runoff. And when we think about climate change, we always think about, oh, it's getting hotter, and we think about summer. Summer's getting hotter. And that, of course, that's all true. But when it comes to our water supply in Colorado, we need to think about winter, because our winter is getting warmer as well. And as we warm our winters from increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what happens is the entire snowpack changes. The temperature, for example, on a mountain of where the freezing line is, moves up the mountain, right? Because if you could stand in one spot on a mountain that had snow in it 50 years ago, if you're at sort of the lowlands, that area might have had snow 50 years ago. But now, as the air temperature warms, the snowpack moves up the mountain. And so if you visualize that mountain, you visualize that snowpack, you can imagine that if you sat there for 50 years, you could see that every winter the snowpack was rising up the mountain, and therefore there was less snow. And so we can see that in the data. So here's the 20th century average of the snowmelt of the Colorado River flows at Lee Ferry. And here's the 21st century average. So we've seen about a 20% drop in flows from climate change. So we'll come back to this later. Let's take a look. Let's go up to the second largest reservoir. Let's start at Lake Powell. So this is a photograph looking downstream near the top of the old Lake Powell, where it used to be. We're on Height Bridge. And just so you can see, these are boats. So you can see a little wake here coming into this boat ramp. This photo is taken around the turn of the century, the beginning of the data you saw. If I took you all there right now, this is what it looks like today. There's no way you're launching a motorboat. This is not happening. This part of Lake Powell is gone. If we go to that boat ramp, we look, this is what you'd be trying to launch on. So Lake Powell is effectively disappearing, and that is a big problem. This is what you'll see on the sides of the boat ramp. It's pretty funny. So it's not very funny, but so this is such a concern that in 2022, the Assistant Secretary of Water and Power at the Department of Interior wrote a letter to the 7 Colorado River Basin states in Mexico and said, this is a major problem, and you all need to figure out a way in the 7 states to cut between 2 and 4 million acre feet. Now you might think, well, okay, you just gave us a summary of climate change. That's what's driving it. And it's certainly true that climate change is driving it. But the letter specifically calls out the problems inside the dam at Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam, as being the need for urgency for these cuts. And we're going to walk through a little bit about why that's the case, why we need to cut that water so quickly because of what we call a plumbing problem. We have a summary of this in this report if you'd like to view it. This was a wonderful research and education program that we did with our partners, the Glen Canyon Institute and the Great Basin Water Network, and published a study together. So here's a cross section of Glen Canyon Dam, designed by the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1950s. Now you might imagine the 1950s, climate change was not a big discussion. It wasn't something that many people knew about or certainly believed in. And when the engineers designed the plumbing system inside Glen Canyon Dam, they weren't thinking about it either. If this is a cross section of the plumbing, which we'll expand here to showcase. So we have, you can see here, two sets of tubes to get water through the bottom of the reservoir, the end of the reservoir, into the Colorado River at the top of Grand Canyon. So the first set of tubes is these hydropower penstocks. They're generating hydroelectricity. And then this is the primary mechanism with which the satisfaction of water delivery to the lower basin is designed to occur through these hydropower tubes, these penstocks. Okay, well, that's fine. We're going to generate hydroelectricity and we're going to satisfy our upper basin water delivery requirement to the lower basin, Mexico included in that. The problem is, as the water levels of Lake Powell drop, eventually we can no longer use those tubes. And that eventuality is coming very, very soon. It's coming within years. So once the water level drops below the intake of those hydropower tubes, we have to move to the second set of tubes called the river outlet works, so called the jet tubes. They were never engineered to deliver 9 million acre feet. Never. You just didn't think about it. They're too high up in the water column, and they're not capable of delivering that much water for fear that Bureau of Reclamation engineers are concerned that they will shake in part and have problems. So this is the purpose of this report and research and education effort, to educate and make everybody in the basin aware of this impending crisis as described in the Assistant Secretary of Water and Power letter to members of the the entire Colorado River Basin. At the level of 3,430 feet of Lake Powell above sea level, the compact will be violated. The upper basin will not be able to deliver lower basin residents its water, purely because of this plumbing problem. And eventually it'll reach dead pool, at which the water is still flowing into the reservoir, but the only amount of water that can flow past the dam is what can make it above this 3370. Now, this illustration creates the appearance that, oh, well, don't worry about it. Once it drops below the hydropower tubes, I'm sure we have plenty of time before we look. But if you look at this construction photograph taken while they were filling Glen Canyon Dam, you can see the distance between these hydropower penstocks right here and those jet tubes right there. It's not a lot of vertical distance. The day is coming when we will be forced to deal with our new incoming future. And so I'm going to shut up now and pass the ball to our wonderful research and policy analyst, Nick Halberg, who's going to give us more of a glimpse into both the science of what's inside this dam and our potential future awaiting us.
Yeah, I think Zach did a good job of painting the big picture problem here, right? This concrete plug in the river is reaching points so low, water levels are getting so low in this concrete plug that it soon could become really difficult to pass water through the dam. It wasn't designed to operate at these very low levels. And that's a real problem. Like Zach said, the Assistant Secretary of Water and Science is like it. So just to show this, this is some researchers at Utah State University, University of Bios in Salt Lake City, and they very conveniently went through the old Bureau documents, the engineering documents that were published when the dam was completed, and took this data and put it into a nice table so we can see here. All this is showing is the maximum rate of discharge, the maximum amount of water that can pass through those lower set of tubes, the river outlet works, at different elevation levels. You see that this decreases because the lower your water gets towards those river outlet works, the less hydraulic head there is, the less pressure there is pushing water through those river outlet works, so we're delivering less water. Here it is in CFS, we maybe don't care about that much. This is what probably people care about. Maximum discharge per year in acre. Those are the total amount of water that can come through the dam each year in acre feet. And we see here, once we get to 3440. We're at 8.5 or 8.28 million acre feet, right around that Mexico violating level. Now we're dropping down below 7.5 million acre feet, all the way down when we get 3,400, 3.5 million acre feet, almost half what the obligation is to the lower basin. So we're delivering really low amounts of water here today. That has impacts for the Grand Canyon and obviously for water users all over the lower basin as well as the upper basin. So that's scary. That's a problem. What we wanted to do really quickly is just a very, very simple, I kind of blush at the simplicity of this forecasting, but really simple look at, is it likely that Lake Powell will get down to these levels? We did this prior to the 2 summers ago. I think we did this spring 2022, and then that summer 2022 was really dry. Lake Powell plummeted, and we said, oh, okay, well, we didn't need to do this. It almost happened. But anyways, we just wanted to let's look at 2 previous periods. Let's look at a period where inflows in the Colorado River were really low, or sorry, we're about normal. So a 20% decline. Inflows during the river this time are about 12 million acre feet. That's what we've seen for most of the 21st century so far. And let's look at a period where they were much worse. Let's look at a period where I think it was down about 10, 11 million acres, right? So what we could be possibly seeing off in the mid-century if some climate sciences projections come true. And we just said, okay, what would Lake Powell levels look like at those? And put some really quick projections up. These are a bit old now because I said we did them a few springs ago. But here's what it looks like with a 20% decline in flows, a 40% decline in flows. So we're really quickly passing these benchmarks, these critical benchmarks, where we said, uh-oh, there's a lot of big problems here. So clearly, this seems to us plausible enough that this could happen in the future. Thankfully, there are some opportunities we have to fix it. It is a dam. It was built by humans. We can rebuild it in ways to make it more usable in the future. As we were doing this, there's some mumblings about studies coming out by the Bureau of Reclamation, which did come out, and we have some slides on that. But basically, we see 2 main options here to try to deal with this problem with the dam. One, we can make these pipes bigger. We can put hydropower penstocks in them. We can make them bigger. We can pass more water through the dam, install more pipes, something like that, right? So that when we're getting down to this level, we're alleviating that problem. But then we said, well, that works for a while, maybe a couple more years. Maybe like Powell water levels keep declining. But what happens when we get down to here or to here, right? We have the same issue we had initially. So the other obvious option is, well, let's put pipes near the base of the dam so we can utilize this whole reservoir, right? We're not stuck with the dead pool level, and we have maximum operational flexibility with this. The Bureau, and just to see what this would look like, this was actually done when the dam was built. So these were bypass tubes that were installed when the dam was built. There's these big tubes that go around the base of the dam, and they diverted the river while the dam was being constructed. The Bureau, when it was finished, filled those with like concrete and reinforced a bunch of other materials. I don't know exactly what's in there. So they're all plugged up now, but they did used to exist. That was a thing that happened. The Bureau of Reclamation finally said, okay, this is a really serious problem. They got an emergency $2 million funding from Congress and did a study to say, let's look at what we can do for this. And came up with a few different options. I think they came up with 6. We're going to show you just 2 of them here. They said, oh, well, we can build a new pipe straight through the dam at the base of the dam. That has some different pros and cons, hydropower generating abilities, things like that, maximum operational flexibility. That was the big key with this. We can use water all the way through the bottom of the dam, or we can reinstall some type of bypass stuff. This may look like we drew these figures. This was actually the Bureau's report. This is what it was. So that's good. This is, as far as we know, and we've talked to some partners and stuff, the first time the Bureau of Reclamation has ever looked at re-engineering or modifying Grand Canyon Dam. So it's a big step in that regard. The problem is so serious now. Everyone is recognizing that the problem is serious, that something needs to be done about it. And just to highlight what the potential solutions would be, with some of these modifications, so these straight through the bottom of the dam, building bypasses around, we're going from 15,000 CFS, where it's at currently, we're increasing that capacity by almost double. So we're really dramatically increasing the amount of water that can pass through Grand Canyon Dam with some of these things. This is, preliminary estimates from the Bureau's quick study they did. The only problem is, since that study came out in, I think it was August 2022 there's been no progress. No plans or follow-up funding for further investigation into this issue. Alternatives identified in the report are not being included in, this is a fancy term, it basically just stands for the official permitting and planning processes happening in the basin right now. And even if it funded today, you can imagine this is a pretty big construction project, right? In our conversations with some of the folks with the Bureau who work on Glen Canyon Dam and this stuff, they're like, yeah, it could be at least 10 years. There's really complicated permitting. It's probably complicated construction, all these different things, right? So the urgency is there, and unfortunately, it's not necessarily a quick fix. Thankfully, there is calls to sort of accelerate some of these efforts, mostly from folks in the lower basin. There was a letter that was submitted recently in one of these planning processes I talked about earlier from some irrigators in the lower basin, some farmers, and the 3 lower basin states. So you guys, California, Arizona, Nevada, representatives from the states wrote a letter and said, hey, we recognize this is a serious problem. We need to start seriously looking at new studies, design, construction, permitting to figure out what to do about Glen Canyon Dam. We don't want to be in a world where we're only able to pass 3 million acre feet of water through the dam. And that is sort of a highlight, not super hopeful, but a bit of a highlight of some of the problems facing Glen Canyon Dam right now. We want to go to the other biggest reservoir in the system and talk about Lake Mead really quick.
So Lake Mead, America's largest reservoir, has received a ton of notoriety in the media, a ton of concern regarding the dropping water levels of this massive, massive reservoir at the end of the Grand Canyon. And so you can see here the water line. You can see the water where the water used to be. This is a relatively high water level. If you go there now, it's even a more dramatic water line because of the declines from climate change, upstream shrinking of our snowpacks. And so we had the largest winter we've had in 40 years last winter, and the reservoir is still at about 36% full. So it was as much as Mother Nature has delivered in about, twice a century, and the Lake Mead barely burnt. So that's a big deal. So let's ask ourselves, how much worse is climate change going to get, right? The question we got to ask ourselves, we've seen about a 20% decline. So is this the bottom? Is this the worst we're going to see in declining snowpacks in the headwaters? Well, here's the science. Here's a graph of the estimates on the y-axis of change in water flows of the Colorado River from climate change shrinking of our snowpacks from a range of peer-reviewed published science. So you see there's a minority of it, especially in some of the earlier science, indicating that, it's going to get wetter. We're going to have more flows. And then, but the majority of the science published goes the other way. It means that reduction, this line here is 0%. And so the majority of the published science is forecasting reductions of water flows in the Colorado River. And this brown line here is this 20% figure. So the question you got to ask yourselves as residents, as constituents, as voters, are we at the bottom of the impacts from climate change in the Colorado River? Meaning, are our policymakers across the globe instituting the rate and scope of proactive change necessary to address our carbon emissions as a global population? Or do we still have a ways to go? Meaning, is climate change going to get worse in impact? Pretty hard to know from the science, but it seems to me that the better thing to do when the car is going around a corner and the tires are squealing and you're in the back seat is to speak up. The most conservative course of action is to prepare for a worst case scenario, meaning it would be wise for us to prepare for a reduction, perhaps as low as a 40% reduction in flows. Nobody knows where the bottom is, but we certainly shouldn't be planning for a wetter future. And we certainly should not be saying 20%, it's going to stop here. It's not really clear that's the case at all. And so I'm sure most of you have probably read about the water cuts that have been driven in Lake Mead. This is called the Drought Contingency Plan. It's also called the interim guidelines that were agreed to in 2007. Those guidelines are expiring in 2026, and the states have been renegotiating you'll notice that what we're looking at just really simply is, imagine this is a cross section of Lake Mead. Okay, so it's just like a glass of water. And as the water level declines, shown here in the elevation of the top of the reservoir, then these three states, Arizona, Nevada, and California, again, the lower basin states, alongside Mexico, have to take cuts to their water allocations, to their water delivery. That's basically all this is. And this is being renegotiated. So here in California, California has not yet entered the cuts. The Lake Mead levels have been going up and down. They've been in this first couple of tiers of range. And so Nevada and Arizona have taken cuts, but California has not entered the game yet. Lake Mead came up a bit, but we're still in these cut levels. And so these totals are being renegotiated. Where we'll land, where they will land, and tell us remains to be seen. But this is what's coming in the future. Oh, sorry, steal your thunder there. So let's look at a little bit of data now. Nick is going to walk through what these percent cuts will do to the lower basin and upper basin allocations.
Yeah, so this is a thinking about the post 2026 guidelines. We're recreating the system. We're figuring out how are we going to deal with the hotter, drier future in the Colorado River Basin. That's what all these big negotiations are meant to address right now. This seems to be like probably where the lower basin is going. I imagine they'll adopt something similar to this, probably bigger water volume cuts. The upper basin, on the other hand, is in a slightly different boat, all again just because of the law of the river and that compact. And let's talk about that a bit. Oops. Okay, so just taking some of these cuts, putting some figures to them. If we're still looking at, like we said, so far, we're in the 21st century average. We're at about a 20% decrease. The natural flow of the Colorado River at the point where the upper and lower basin split, point called Lee Ferry, has been about 12.4 million acre feet. That's less than we used to have, 15.2, right? But again, we could see decreases all the way down to 40%, possibly a 9 million acre foot river. I think this next exercise is a really useful thing to explore, to look at what could happen to the upper basin in some of these worst scenarios, right? So the way the math works for the law of the river, this is, heavily disputed. A lot of this is probably going to change in the future, but the previous sort of mainstream interpretations of a lot of this has been there's some amount of water in the river. The upper basin has to deliver 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin. Then they have to take maybe half of the delivery to Mexico. So the United States sends a treaty to Mexico. We deliver 1.5 million acre feet. Maybe the upper basin has to split half of that. I say maybe because this is very contentious, disputed by the upper and lower basin, who has to give how much water to Mexico. But say the upper basin has to deliver half of that, that's 750,000 acre feet. And then there's this little provision in the 1948 compact. Arizona has this little sliver of land in the upper basin, they get 50,000. So you subtract out all these amounts, and what you're left with is the leftover water that those four upper basin states split based on those percentages. So where we live, Utah, we get 23% of whatever this leftover is, right? And we have a report on our website that kind of walks through all this stuff. We have, I think, our website on the slide at the end, so you can check it out there if you want more info. But the key with this is, look, in a 12 million acre foot river, the upper basin is about 4 million acre feet. I think we're currently in the upper basin using just slightly more than that. So we're kind of right within our means right now. We could probably decrease that a bit. But as climate change gets worse, if it gets worse, a 9 million acre foot river with the four upper basin states are using 800,000 acre feet. That's what they're allotted under the old law of the river. That doesn't seem to be a really tenable way to live. Certainly none of the upper basin representatives thinks that's tenable. Even a lot of folks in the lower basin say that's kind of nuts. I don't, who can live on that much water? I don't think that's what the compact was designed to do. It shouldn't be all up to the upper basin to absorb all of those cuts, right? These are the big questions that the states are asking themselves headed into these 2026 negotiations. How are we going to deal with the shrinking river? Who gets those cuts? So just to kind of wrap up, we wanted to paint some big picture problems, and we have a hopeful solution at the end. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. But basically, as we're heading into the next little while through the Colorado River, we're asking ourselves some of these big questions. One, can we move beyond this upper versus lower basin divide? Does it make sense to continue this, political split of the upper and lower basin? Is that helping us? Is it hurting us? If if it's hurting us more, is there a way we can get past that fundamental part of the 1922 compact? Can we figure out better ways to live beyond that? And importantly, probably the most important question, how do we share water shortages? Who cuts water? Who cuts how much water? How does that happen? All these things.
So a couple other big picture questions we need to ask ourselves. You know, we're so used to thinking about ourselves as Americans based on what state we live in. That's such a key component to our identity. I'm a Californian, I'm a Utah, I'm a Nevadan, right? We got to kind of let go of some of that, and we especially have to let go of this upper lower basin. We got to start thinking about equity. Okay, we got to start thinking about less about what our identity is and more about how we're doing with each other. So let me give you a couple examples. Nevada's allocation of Colorado River water is just 300,000 acre feet. Most of that water goes to the Las Vegas Basin with a population about almost 3 million people, 2.7 million. Okay, 300,000 acre feet for 2.7 million people. By contrast, Utah's allocation is currently using about 1 million acre feet, probably not quite, and the population also about 2.8 million people. So very similar populations, very different Colorado River allocations. Why? Are we making a judgment or a value system that people in Nevada don't deserve Colorado River water as much as Utah? What is that equity about? The states in the upper basin make arguments criticizing lower basin water use when it suits them. Players inside Utah will say the lower basin needs to cut its use. Well, does that include Nevada? They're listed. They've been cutting water use. They have a paltry amount of water out of the Colorado River Compact, and they've been taking cuts. Utah hasn't taken any cuts. Why? Equity, obviously, especially paramount to the sovereign tribes of the Colorado River Basin. Those tribes have treaty obligations with the United States that predate the 1922 Compact. Some of them as tribes were recognized as sovereign nations after the 22 Compact, but those are senior water rights, especially if they predate the Compact. Yet many tribes, including on the Utah-Arizona border, the Navajo Nation, are still don't have any clean drinking water to their residents. They have to take trucks with empty water containers to a community facility and fill them up with clean drinking water to go back to their house. So wait a minute, I thought this was about equity. It's about equity. Why are we not honoring these sovereign nations with water that they were given treaty obligations to receive? So equity needs to be level. We don't just use equity when it suits a particular player. Equity has to be equal, right? And then the last role and how we're gonna wrap up now is the simple concept of economics. So the decision-making inside the Colorado River Basin is largely driven by 7 water managers in a closed door room like this one, a room in which 7 basin water managers come together and they negotiate policy. And, you know, the phrase I'd like to use about governance is this phrase that I'm stealing. I don't remember who it's from, but the only worse form of government than democracy is everything else. And so, in other words, if we don't, as a people, have the ability to influence policymaking, to influence negotiation, to influence this dialogue, then how are we supposed to make decisions as stakeholders? Because it's not members of Congress that are negotiating this. So we understand that the negotiating process to get 6 other states, whoever they're representing, and Mexico, whichever entity you're talking about. You know, it's much easier to come to agreement with 7 parties than it is with 40 million people, right? But at the same time, this decision-making structure has got to go from the back room to the front room. And as residents, we need to be able to have roles of influencing policy, which we typically do not have in the governance and negotiating process right now. So economics offers a wonderful opportunity for us to level the playing field, for us to have conversations about all of these things and more, because looking through the lens of economics allows us to look for opportunities for compromise, for working together, and for creating productive policy. And so I just want to mention this wonderful thing, this hydroeconomic model. Now, if you don't know, if you've never heard of a hydroeconomic model, these are wonderful collaborative efforts that have been designed and implemented across the globe in other continents to help stakeholders come together, looking through the lens of water and economics together, to see all of the stakeholders and all of the low-hanging fruit in identifying opportunities. And there is a hydroeconomic model being developed here at the University of California, Riverside School of Public Policy. And if I were a student here, I would be stalking those principal investigators, trying to volunteer, to be an intern, to be have some role in helping advance this, because what we see in this hydroeconomic model that's being developed now at the for the Colorado River Basin is the first ever opportunity for numerous stakeholders to come together and have a role in discussing how our future, our shared climate future, is going to look and where the opportunities are. It's being led by some of our wonderful hosts for this talk, ariel, Mead, Daniel Crespo, Puri Ajami, and Juan Triana. And this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And we are really excited to see how this develops and where it goes, because this is really, you can see all of the inputs being built into this hydroeconomic model. We're getting away from this idea that supply side decisions on the part of engineers are the only way we're going to develop water policy. We're getting more into demand management in economics. We're getting more into evaluating how we use water and valuing water itself for its own right for all stakeholders, including the environment. And with that, Nick and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I believe we have some time for some questions. That's great, because we can stop showing PowerPoint slides. We have like 400, which we can go through if you want to keep going. But otherwise, we'd love to open the floor to questions that we can just facilitate them. I don't know if there was a facilitator. We're good, right?
Me too, I can. If not, then yeah.
If you feel called to, that's great. We're happy to do so. I'm not trying to. Do we have any questions inside the room? Yes.
What's the percentage of the year when the Colorado River does not actually even make it to the ocean?
Oh boy, 99.9%. Honestly, many years, 365 days in a year.
So for the most part, it doesn't even make it.
Yes, it's 100% diverted and does not flow into the Sea of Cortez anymore. You know, what's interesting about that? That was a fantastic aquatic ecosystem. The Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold's seminal environmental work, includes this really wonderful account of what the Colorado River estuary was at Sea of Cortez. When you have a freshwater river flowing into an ocean body, what you have is all of this biological input into saltwater column. And that biological input is the base of that aquatic ecosystem in an estuary. And that's why estuaries are such abundant biodiversity treasures. There were 1,000 species of wildlife at the estuary where the Colorado entered the Sea of Cortez, the Pacific Ocean. But it never makes it. There was an effort about 2012, thank you, to try and buy water through a whole range of negotiations, largely led by conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy, to get water to that estuary as a pulse, as a temporary thing. Widely celebrated as wonderful, but yeah, it doesn't. Thank you. I want to also say that like I'm actually a really positive and optimistic person. I know some of this stuff's hard to hear and it's hard to hear stories of climate change and feel a sense of hope. But it's really important to understand that we can change these things. It's not impossible. It's hard to hear bad news and keep your sense of optimism. But the reality is that it's actually really kind of easy to change policy. Nick and I have been involved, lucky enough to be involved in a number of really influential efforts that changed the fate of what we're experiencing in Utah. We've saved rivers. We have got legislation passed and become law. We've instituted comprehensive water conservation programs through the work of our wonderful partners inside and outside government. So I don't want to convey any sense of hopelessness. It's really fun to be involved in solutions, and they're not as hard as they seem. So I'll give you a tough answer, but it doesn't mean you should be feeling like there's no hope. Other questions or comments of any nature? Yes.
My question is more about like, I guess like the environment and wildlife. How does that affect like the dams and the different infrastructure? Just curious on that.
Could you give us a little more about what you're asking about specifically in regards to wildlife and the dams?
Fish, animals, that do the water.
There's a lot of, I mean, so there's a lot of really interesting things. So a lot of there's like, I guess now there's 3. There used to be 4 big threatened and endangered fish species. One of them got not delisted, but moved up a little bit. It was doing slightly better in the Grand Canyon. But there's these 4 really remarkable fish in the Grand Canyon, and they all evolved for a wild Colorado River, right? One where you imagine all the snow in those big headwater mountains melting off really quickly, creating these crazy spring torrents of just huge amounts of water gushing down, and then easing out to have really low water later in the hot, dry summer. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Yampa River. It's like one of the last undammed rivers. It's a tributary to the Colorado up in the state of Colorado. And similar, has huge spring flows and then really low water. So these fish evolved to live in those kinds of environment. And now we have all these dams. The Colorado River is a very regulated river system. So we have all of these artificial flows through. We have smaller flows, more even flows. It's very consistent through a lot of the year. And that has different effects on the fish species. We've also introduced a lot of different fish. In Lake Powell, we've introduced different species of bass for sport fishing and stuff like that. Now some of those bass are actually getting sucked through the hydropower turbines, spit out into the Grand Canyon. They predate on some of the native fish, so there's bad things there. But also, there's a lot of solutions. There's really great high flow experiments they do out of Grand Canyon Dam, where they send a bunch of high water through really quickly to try to push sediments, to try to recreate some of those big pulse flows you get in the spring, to help restore native fish populations, things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's, we've totally changed the character of the Colorado River, and that's had a lot of effect on native fish species. But more than any of that, just taking water out of the river, diversions, uses, agricultural runoff affecting water quality, all those things have had, arguably bigger impacts on fish species than just the dams themselves.
And I have a question from Zoom. They want to know, can you talk about who's going to be involved in upcoming talks for 2026 renegotiations? Are they environmentalists, scientists, or other stakeholders?
Wonderful question. Thank you. So yeah, the who's going to be involved in the renegotiation of those interim guidelines, the Lake Mead levels? It really is those 7 water managers. They go into a room, they make a decision that works for the 7 of them and their constituents, at least as they view it, and then they come out of the front room and they announce to the world, this is what we're doing, and then they work to convince Congress to ratify said agreement. So conservationists and others are generally not heavily engaged. There are notable exceptions. We can all of us can approach the water managers negotiating and try and make our case known, and lobby for it, if you will, press for it, request it. But in terms of like having an actual seat at the table, very, very few parties really have a seat at the table beyond the water managers. Would you like to speak a little more in the detail?
I mean, I think that's like practically the truth, I think if we talk about who has the most influence over that process, it's the state representatives, absolutely. But also I kind of waved my hand at it earlier, but there's a thing up there that said NEPA, that stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. And that whole law, that law exclusively exists so that members of the public, conservation groups, anybody else can make their voices heard in important permitting processes like this. So the Bureau of Reclamation is doing a NEPA process right now, and they call it's for the post 2026 operating guidelines. It has a really long, easy title, but if you Google that, you'll find it. And they periodically do public input comments where they ask the public, what do you think about our plans? What can we do to improve all that stuff? How much they listen to you, that's maybe that's up for debate depending on how skeptical or not you are. But yeah, you can get involved. That's one of the things that Congress did for us. We can get involved. We can put our voices into this process and hopefully, advocate for your interests, your own community's interests, things you care about, anything.
Yeah, the NEPA work, which is what you hear about when you hear about environmental assessments or environmental impact statements, that's a function of this National Environmental Policy Act. And the public can provide comments, we can, go to official meetings, we can campaign, we can write letters to the editor and opinion pieces, we can hold press conferences, we can try and influence public policy through our opinions and through our networking, through everything from social media to mainstream media. So that's kind of who can be involved. Are there other questions on this? Okay. Are there other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, agriculture, particularly in Imperial Valley, you've got folks down there that have been grandfathered in, I believe, from 1922. How are policies being driven? Because I mentioned a lot of them want to try to hold on to the grandfathered policies.
Yeah, so Imperial Irrigation has 80% of the water rights for California. And Imperial is a really interesting agricultural community. 90% of the country's iceberg lettuce comes from the Imperial Valley. So people don't realize when they sit down for dinner every night that they're likely eating produce on that dinner table that was grown in the Imperial Valley. So, the cuts that you saw, for the interim guidelines for Lake Mead, that's chiefly going to fall on Imperial Valley. The real question is, kind of coming back to who's going to have to cut water. There's a lot of really low value water agricultural operations in the upper basin that are growing alfalfa hay that are really, alfalfa is a valuable crop, but it's water intensive. And so there's opportunities there to explore the possibility of compensating farmers to put that water into the Colorado River system for lower basin use. What's interesting about that is that, the longer you can keep water in the Colorado River, meaning if you look at it back to the map, the more water you can keep going from the headwaters down the lower basin, that's better for the river, right? So if you can look for opportunities to retire temporarily agriculture in the upper basin, then that's going to benefit the river. Whereas at the foot of the basin, down at the lower basin, there's not as many environmental benefits. Although it's a super crude generalization, as you'll see when the hydroeconomic model comes out, there's so much complexity that my simplifications kind of don't do it justice. But definitely that's the right question to ask. How are we going to start cutting water, and where is the low-hanging fruit to do so? Thank you. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
I guess it depends too. So water kind of like groundwater and then like control environment agriculture, and like compared to traditional like outdoor like agriculture, like how does that affect like the water stream?
It's like, I don't want to claim to be an expert on groundwater at all. And certainly the groundwater issues that we face in Utah that I'm more familiar with are significantly different than the groundwater issues in like the Central Valley or down here or in Arizona or something like that. So I don't know that I could answer so much of that, but I do know that Dr. Mead, who's sitting in front of you, has been working quite a lot on subsidence issues and a lot of that stuff, and knows far more than me. So maybe that's a question he'd be better equipped to answer. As far as like, controlled systems agriculture or something like that. There's a interesting effort that happened in Utah where a farmer converted all their land and started growing all their alfalfa. They're primarily a rancher, but they grow their own alfalfa to feed their cows. And they started doing all of that in some sort of, I don't know exactly what the technology is, but indoor greenhouse style thing. They're using a fraction of the water. It was, tremendously more expensive than getting a field and flood irrigating it, right? So they had to have a lot of upfront capital to do it, but they used significantly less water. And it was such an impressive operation. A lot of representatives from our state legislature went down there to check it out and see if there's maybe something to use elsewhere. So I don't know much more beyond that. I know they're having success with it. I think the problem is it's really expensive. Where does the money come from to do that up front? Is that how scalable or viable that is? I can't say, but it seems promising. Yeah.
One piece to add that, farmers get a lot of criticism for how much water they use. But it's a really marginal operation. I have horses, we buy alfalfa hay, and they live in our backyard, and I unload hay. So I know I've met a lot of alfalfa farmers, and so they're not rich. They're land rich, but they're cash poor. And so they're not making a lot of money. And so they have these really ancient water delivery systems. I mean, 4th or 5th generation farmers inherited a water delivery system that, the first generation constructed, dirt canals, but they don't have any money, any capital to change. And so we have these dirt canals in the American West that are seeping water in the ground, diverting our precious aquatic ecosystems. And we're just seeping it in the ground because we're not valuing it properly, because we're not recognizing the value of water. We give it the lip service that it's valuable, but when it comes to the economics, we don't do so financially. Most of us live in cities. That's where the capital is going to have to come from. We can't just, finger wag farmers and say you should use less water. They need capital to improve their systems, and in exchange, what us taxpayers get that live in the cities is we can get water in the system, and we can get water in the river for the benefit of threatened and endangered fish, and we can get water to stakeholders that really need it, like the tribes of the Colorado River Basin. So thank you very much for having us here. We're honored to speak with you today, and we love the discussion. So we want to thank the University of California Riverside School of Public Policy, Mehdi Namadi, Ariel Dinar, Daniel Crespo. Thank you so much for having us down here. Look forward to speaking with you again all in the future.
That was extremely informative, very necessary. Thank you for breaking it down, for making it relatable, and for reassuring that it is implementable. So and we can all do our part to do that. That's not something that just comes from Washington, D.C. That actually comes from people like Mr. Frankel and Mr. Halberg. So one more round of applause. Real quickly before we wrap it up, I do want to mention the second part of the water seminar series will be on November 15th. I believe that is a Wednesday. And then we have our public service job fair next Wednesday, October 25th, hosted by Office of Congressman Mark Takano. Please come to both of those. And then obviously spp.ucr.edu. You can see everything on there that we're doing. And that includes our podcast policy chats. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.